Okay, so it looks like most of us are here. We're still waiting on a few more people, but we'll go ahead and get started. So on behalf of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, welcome everyone, bienvenue, and thank you for joining the April Bibliometrics and Research Impact Canadian Community of Practice call, where we'll be discussing the state of PIDs in Canada. I'm Julie Morin, a Senior Program Officer at CARL, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that today's speaker and participants are joining us from the unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. My home and the CARL office, located here in Ottawa, are built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and we welcome you to add your own land acknowledgements into the chat. Links to the CARL Code of Conduct will be posted in the chat, and the organizers of this call are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience. If you have any questions or concerns about this, please contact Susan Haig, CARL Executive Director, whose contact information will also be listed in the chat. Also, note that the presentation portion of today's call will be recorded and shared with the community of practice afterwards. Today, we will be hearing from John Aspler, manager of the Canadian Persistent Identifier community at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, who supports the use of PIDs like ORCiD IDs and DOIs across the country. Dedicated to public service and knowledge access, John has experience working in research and public library contexts. He graduated from McGill University with a PhD in neuroscience in 2021, where he worked on several projects about media discourse and neurodevelopmental disabilities. Bien que la discussion de ce mois-ci se déroulera principalement en anglais, notez que John est bilingue et peut répondre aux questions en français et en anglais. John will be presenting for about 20 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions and discussion. So thank you, John, for joining us today. And without further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Merci beaucoup. I'm very excited to be here chatting with the BRIC community. I think that some of the slides I'm going to be presenting today will be a little bit familiar, especially to those of you who attended last June's conference or last May's conference, whenever the 2022 conference took place. But I've aimed to update them and reorient the slides a little bit more towards questions about research impact and some of the things that I think the BRIC community might find the most interesting and compelling. But the overall picture that I want to paint is one that looks very much at the work that we're doing toward the development of a national PID strategy for Canada. So Julie's already introduced myself, but has already introduced me. But one of the things I want to say about myself is that the work that I do as the manager of the Canadian Persistent Identifier community involves supporting two specific consortia. That's ORCiD Canada and DataCite Canada. And I'll talk a little bit more about the two of those consortia specifically in a bit. So my focus today is basically just going to be on some sort of very basic introductory, what is a PID, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. I'll talk a little bit about the context of PIDs in Canada, as well as the question of the PID strategy we're working on. And I think that there are a lot of ways that the work that we're doing around PIDs and PID strategy connects directly to the question of research impact. But I think that I'm going to leave that primarily for discussion and questions after the presentation. So what is a PID? We've been working with a consultant for the last few years named More Brains Cooperative. They are a group of folks who have all worked at a variety of PID registration agencies around the world, including ORCiD, including DataCite, and they specifically have an expertise in helping develop national PID strategies. They've worked really closely with Australia and the UK. They've been working with us for about a year and a half now, and they're also starting to work on some projects, I believe, with the folks in Finland and the Netherlands, if I'm not getting that wrong, but they are essentially our sort of global experts in international approaches to PIDs and specifically national PID strategies. So I'm going to start with a very basic definition from them, and that is that a persistent identifier or PID is a globally unique digital string of characters that is associated with a single thing. They use the word thing very much on purpose because it can be anything. Anything in the research ecosystem can have a PID. It can be a research output, it can be a person, it can be an organization, and then you can get down into really nitty-gritty specific things. You can have a research resource, you can have a PID for a very specific kind of sample. There are all kinds of uses of persistent identifiers. Any singular entity that exists in the research ecosystem could potentially be given a PID. Here are three of the most common examples, and you'll notice some similarities among all of these, I guess, URLs, but also specifically the digital code that represents the PID. So the first one is an ORCiD ID. That's my ORCiD ID. And the actual identifier itself is the 16-digit code ending in 4357. So it's just fully, it can be alphanumeric. In my case, it's exclusively numeric, but it's just a 16-digit alphanumeric code. You can see then, of course, the DOIs. I'm sure you're all extremely familiar with that, and ROR, which is the Research Organization Registry. Similarly, you have these alphanumeric strings, and that's really important because one of the goals of PIDs is that they are digital and machine readable. And PIDs have a number of characteristics that are really important to highlight. They are, of course, persistent. It's in the name, but we'll talk a little bit more about persistence in a bit. They are global. And I should say that there are lots of different PIDs that are not global. An employee number might in some ways be a kind of PID, but it's not going to leave your current employer's institution. It's locked and located in that space. There are also PIDs that exist internationally, but that are locked to particular databases or particular proprietary systems. So when I talk about the PIDs I'm going to focus on, I really am focusing on global, not-for-profit PID registration agencies and open infrastructure and the way that those parts of the ecosystem interact. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other things that are PIDs. It's just the global component is really, really important as we start to talk about research connectivity and findability, FAIR principles, etc. Of course, the uniqueness is also very much the point. They have to be unique because otherwise you're going to be pointing to the same thing or to different things with the same code. Each of those strings of characters needs to be unique. And of course, again, they are digital because no one's going to look at 0000170554357 and say, that's John Aspler. That's what my name is for. But there might be lots of people with names that are similar to me. And so while informally in conversation, it's easier to refer to me as a person with a name. When machines are trying to point to things, it's helpful to have something that is really unique. That is this John Aspler or perhaps this John Smith, rather than the million other people with the same or a similar name. Part of the definition I want to also share is that PIDs are the anchors that facilitate links between related pieces of information. So it's not just about pointing uniquely to a thing and saying that is a place and that is a person and that is a publication, that is a data set, etc. It's also about connecting all of those things together. So that connectivity and that anchoring is really, really key to the discussion as well. IDs are labels that refer to a specific entity in the information landscape, again, such as an object, organization, person, data set. Again, it's anything. It's a capital T thing. So it points to something, it disambiguates it from all of the other things that are like it, and it also helps to connect them together. And part of the digital landscape around PIDs is that most of these open, not-for-profit, persistent identifying, supporting registration agencies like ORCiD, like DataCite, like Crossref, they all have open and public-facing APIs. There are some tools that are only available to members and people who are paying for those services or institutions paying for those services, but overall, there's a very robust public and open digital infrastructure to facilitate the passing of information back and forth, which is another reason why the digital component of this is really, really key. So that connectivity is possible. If I have an ORCiD ID, which is that 16-digit string, and I have 15 publications, which are DOIs, my ORCiD ID in some ways can serve as one number pointing to 15 numbers. And each of those numbers, the publications or data sets or outputs, maybe those connect back to the various people I've published with. So now each of those DOIs is also a link to 3, 4, 5 ORCiD IDs. And as we start to integrate ROR into this and other kinds of PIDs into these conversations, suddenly the publication has a link to a few different RORs, and those RORs have a link to a set of publications and a set of scholars, and all of these things are connected together. The last thing I want to talk about is that question of persistence, because persistence is not inherent to a persistent identifier, which is maybe a bit of a strange thing to say. They are persistent in a lot of ways, but they still require community and staff support and engagement to ensure that they remain persistent. And in particular, I'm talking about DOIs, and I'll explain why in a second. So many of you probably know Mike Mason. He's at UND, but he's also the chair of the ORCiD Canada Governing Committee. And so one of the things that we've chatted about is some of the ways that a DOI, for example, can help point to a thing that changes location. So traditionally, we share or locate digital things using a link, a URL, and using PIDs, I can update the location if the content moves. So I provide a persistent link. That DOI never dies. It is a persistent link. Even as the name of a URL changes. So that persistent link exists even if the thing it points to changes. So maybe it points to a different URL. Maybe that item, that data set has gone away. We will never get it back. It is gone. The DOI can at the very least be updated to point to a tombstone page so that the link resolves to something. So that's where this idea of persistence is not inherent. PIDs must be supported through PID registration agencies like ORCiD, like DataCite, like Crossref, like ROAR. And that includes membership, financial support to ensure that these organizations are sustainable. And that also includes, like I said, the work of staff to actively maintain the metadata stored in association with a given PID. DOIs in particular are going to be things that have lots and lots of different ways to manually update them as needed. One quick research impact thing, DataCite DOIs have a field or a series of fields called cited by or cited in that point to the things citing it and the things it cites. Typically, that kind of updating of the metadata does require some sort of manual tracking. There are some ways to automate it, of course, but not everyone is doing that. And so research impact is not also inherent to PIDs. It's the kind of thing that you need to make sure that when these things are being connected together, you are tracking and managing and checking on pretty regularly. And that sort of brings us to the PID ecosystem. This is a diagram that sort of represents all of, again, the capital T things. We've got some repositories that point to software or workflows or an entire research project. And if you sort of squint at this diagram, you can see that some of these things are talking about DOIs for radically different parts of the ecosystem. DOIs are probably our most recurring PID for the widest range of things. You've got the ORCiD ID for people, and you've got the grant ID for funding, although again, grant IDs are typically DOIs. And the whole point of this diagram really is just to point to some of the problems that PIDs help to solve. PIDs help to disambiguate things from each other. They help to connect those things together so that the right scholar is pointed at the right research output or the right organization, among other things. And ultimately, part of what they do is they help us move towards the sort of all-important supporting of FAIR principles. And as many of you probably know, the first FAIR principle, findability, literally starts with F1, metadata are assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. That is the very first point of any of the FAIR principles. So it's baked into the way that we're looking to build sort of the digital open infrastructure for scholarship of the future. But I really do want to emphasize that findability is sort of one of the key problems that PIDs aim to solve. Like I said, if the location of something changes, you can always update that DOI to ensure that it remains pointing at the content you want it to be pointing at, and making sure that you can point back to the people and the places. That's all really, really key to how this ecosystem works. And I won't go into this in much detail because I think I've already sort of tackled a bunch of it, but ORCiD IDs, of course, are PIDs for people. DOIs are PIDs for things. In this case, this is a publication, and you can see on the publication page that there are a set of ORCiD IDs that are connected to. So again, you can move back and forth. Some of this is on the user interface side, so I can just helpfully click here on John Aspler and see, oh, which John Aspler is he? What things has he published? But also, if you're using the sort of machine side of things, you can always be using the API to move through metadata that are all connected together. And beyond sort of those two PIDs, which I very explicitly support in Canada, there are many other PIDs. Like I said, ROAR is the Research Organization Registry. There's a new emerging one called RAID, the Research Activity Identifier, which is supposed to represent a research project. So you can sort of connect grants and scholars and outputs together at this sort of mid-level PID. It's not that it's actually new, but it is new to the international community. It was previously developed in Australia, and very, very recently, I believe it was approved by ISO for certain international uses. And the UK is spooling up some RAID-related work. And then, of course, as I said, DOIs for pretty much everything. They're grant IDs, they're research resources, they're software, they're all kinds of things. And that sort of points the other fair principle that I think is worth talking about here is interoperability. Because of course, if all of these PIDs are being developed by different PID agencies, but their APIs are working closely together to exchange information themselves between PIDs, but also between the PID registries, whether that's DataCite or registry, and your local systems. So you collect a list of publications and you're pulling that out of someone's ORCiD record. Well, interoperability is the key here. You're using the ORCiD API to obviously speak to a system that may not speak your system's language so that you can pull out information that you need. And of course, it's multi-directional. There's, in the case of ORCiD in this case, information can also be pushed into an ORCiD record with a scholar's permission. And then, if a publisher pushes publication metadata into that person's ORCiD record, and the employer, the university, is pushing degree granting or faculty positions into an ORCiD record, if the funders are pushing grant information into an ORCiD record, then that means that each of these other systems are able to more efficiently update and do what they need to do. If the employer wants to know what's going on with publication, well, once the publisher adds the article metadata to that person's ORCiD record, the employer or the database that's being filled can then be automatically updated. Or when the funding information comes in, that can happen too. And beyond making information more findable and interoperable and more automatic, there's also a fairly significant benefit, or at least estimated benefit, of PIDs tied to time saving and reduction of administrative burden. Although I should have probably put a clip on here, both the UK and the Australian groups working on this have done some work with, again, more brains on the return on investment and the amount of money as well as the amount of hours that people work that's saved. And it's quite significant. I believe the most recent report out of the Australian group was something like 60 million a year, maybe it was a bit more, that's saved. The UK, when they previously did this, I think they had a slightly more conservative estimate, but all that to say that we're talking about the tens of millions of dollars, assuming the uptake is wide and significant, of course. It's only once the uptake actually happens that we see those savings. One of the reasons why I want to talk about time savings and reduction of administrative burden, again, using this diagram, is if I'm a scholar and I have to constantly fill out the same information about my publication list over and over and over and over again, and instead I can just maintain my ORCiD record and then have my ORCiD record information pulled into whatever system I need to be updating, whether that's grant applications, whether that's an institutional database of publications, whether that's a faculty web profile, I can save time by making that all happen from one space, transferring it to another instead of submitting it many, many times over and rewriting it. Similarly, when I'm actually doing those applications, information about my affiliation could be brought into a grant form or could be brought into a submission form for a journal. So many of you probably already know a lot of that, but really what I want to emphasize here is just that PIDs are potentially one of the things that can be part of the backbone of open scholarly infrastructure, especially because of the ability to disambiguate, find, and enable interoperability. So what about PIDs in the Canadian context? That was a sort of very long and definitely longer introduction than I provided, I think, at the BRIC conference last year. So hopefully that was more in-depth and helpful. But so for PIDs in Canada, I want to give you a brief overview of that. Again, some of this will be familiar to you, but my goal is to update you from what I spoke about last time. And for those of you who weren't there, hopefully this is all relevant and new for you. So in Canada, the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, CRKN, which I work for, administers and manages those two PID consortia I mentioned, ORCiD Canada and DataCite Canada. And the goal of those consortia are, of course, to provide directly services bilingually to institutions across the country who want to support the integration of ORCiD into their systems or who want to register DOIs through DataCite. So we support the national adoption and uptake of PIDs, as well as their integration into a variety of systems. CRKN alone is the administrative lead of ORCiD Canada, but we share the management of DataCite Canada with the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, who, again, I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with. That co-management has been really, really key to the path that we've been able to take the last few years toward the development of a national strategy. By taking on DataCite Canada in partnership, and importantly, by providing centralized funding, first for DataCite Canada, but then later for ORCiD Canada, and ultimately the development of the national PID strategy. The partnership that we've had with the Alliance has enabled the direct provision of services through these consortia, as well as the reduction in fees, and ultimately this sort of higher level strategic oversight and engagement that we're looking to do as we develop that strategy. So there is this committee that provides an advisory role to both of the consortia here. That's the Canadian Persistent Identifier Advisory Committee. Both consortia have their own governing committees. They are made up of member institutions, while the CPIDAC is a higher level, broader umbrella group that includes all kinds of stakeholders. It includes your universities, it includes infrastructure, it includes academic library consortia like Carl. I think I saw Susan on the call, who's on that committee. It includes infrastructure organizations, many of which have now been taken over by the Alliance, but previously there were 4 or 5 of them that were separate, like Compute Canada. So there are a number of key stakeholders that are engaging here. Oh, and of course, I forgot to mention the federal funders and provincial funders. All of the tri-agency, all 3 of the tri-agency branches are there. Plus, we have some provincial funders out of Quebec, Alberta, and BC. So there's quite a bit of work that's being done with this group, through this group, to advise the existing consortia, but also to look beyond them, to think about that PID strategy, to think about what we can do with ROAR and RAID and all of these other PIDs that are being used, but are not necessarily being centrally funded or meaningfully supported across the country. So I won't go into too much detail about the specifics of the consortium, other than to say that we currently have about 45 members, which range from, I think of those 45, 33 are universities, most of which are from the university library. But we do have a number of government departments and agencies, as well as other kinds of organizations like research networks and hospital networks and things like that. There are over 185,000 ORCiD IDs in Canada, although that is likely a conservative estimate. And again, it is a PID for people that centers scholars. And one of the keys to what's been enabling us to move forward with a national PID strategy has been the member model that the ORCiD Canada and DataCite Canada consortia enable. Because CRKN is a member-driven organization, we were able to leverage our existing membership to create the ORCiD Canada consortium. DataCite Canada is a little bit different. It existed for a while before we took it over with the Alliance. It was previously run out of the National Research Council in the federal government. But suffice it to say that the membership model in both of those consortia have enabled us to sort of grow a community of practice around PIDs in Canada as we look to move forward with the other kinds of PIDs that maybe don't have quite as organic or grassroots or bottom-up a potential approach. There is some work for us to be done around a broader PID community of practice. On the DataCite side, DataCite provides DOIs largely for data sets, but there is a large, as we talked about, there are DOIs for pretty much everything. There is a large gray zone between sort of the traditional cross-ref is for peer-reviewed publications and DataCite is for data sets. There's government reports, there's academic blog posts, there's everything that could possibly need a DOI. And there are DOIs being registered with DataCite that are publications. And I'm sure there are DOIs being registered with Crossref that are data sets. I don't know that for sure, but I suspect that's the case. So there's quite a bit of overlap among the services that are provided, although the metadata schema for DataCite is much more geared towards data sets. At the moment, there are 64 members, and you can see that sort of the jump from 2021 to 2022, we went from 39,000 to 51,000 DOIs. There's been quite a bit of growth in the use of this service over the last few years, although they are largely driven by 3 or 4 particularly high DOI minting organizations, such as UBC, University of Alberta. But the community has been growing quite a bit. Since we took it over in 2020, we've gained, I believe, 16 members. And none of that is with a coherent engagement strategy. We haven't been going out there asking people to come join us. People have just been coming to us and asking about the service. So once we do start a more serious engagement strategy like we have for ORCiD Canada, I think that we'll probably see some fairly significant uptake there. So I'm going to just end by talking a little bit about where we are with the development of a national PID strategy. I guess the first thing I want to sort of address is the question of why might we want a national strategy? Why aren't we focusing on institutional strategies or provincial strategies or an international approach? And there are a lot of different reasons. One of them is funding and the way funding works and resourcing. That's certainly driving all these questions. But ultimately, the point of PIDs is that they connect, again, everything, all the capital T things in the research ecosystem, connects it all together. And we can't really make that happen without a community-driven and community-focused approach. So the CPIDs, which has such broad representation across a huge number of sectors in research, that is by design. Within an institution, libraries, research offices, IT, HR, they all need to be working together. And that's complicated and takes time and strategic planning. And that's what the idea of Canadian PID strategy is there to do. It's both being driven by community needs and aiming to address a multi-sectoral approach to the adoption of PIDs. And before I sort of say anything else about PIDs, sometimes I think that, especially me, but people in situations like I am in, have the tendency to emphasize PIDs as a good in and of themselves, or we're just doing PIDs for the sake of PIDs. But of course, that's not the goal. PIDs need to be solving specific problems that researchers and research institutions and funders and publishers, et cetera, are having. So a goal of a national PID strategy, while it will involve increasing uptake and increasing membership and all of those things, that's not the end goal. Those are all in service of the broader vision, which is thinking about the future of an interconnected, digital, open research ecosystem. So all of this community-driven work and collaboration, it requires significant collaboration across all of those different stakeholders. And it's also a bit of a chicken and an egg thing. If we don't have wide engagement and wide support and integration of PIDs into systems, then the benefits like the tens of millions in savings and reduction in research administrative burden, those can't necessarily be seen if not all of the stakeholders are sort of working together. It's all really important that the initiatives that are being driven here, as they are happening in conjunction with other initiatives, bring more and more benefit to each of the different stakeholders and stakeholder groups involved. Maybe the last thing I'll say on this point is that the Canadian government a couple of years ago issued their roadmap for open science, and every single Canadian science-based department and agency within the federal government has been tasked with developing an action plan for open science. And a good number of those have been published, and a good number of those that have been published include explicit reference to PIDs and ORCiD and DOIs. And again, not for PID's sake, but for the sake of thinking about how they can support and service findability, interoperability, the opening up of research and research data. I've already talked about the governance. Maybe the one thing I'll talk about around the PID strategy development is that More Brains, I mentioned them, they're the consultant group that we work with, has been working with CRK and the Alliance and the CPIDs to develop a number of different projects, one of which, of course, includes ultimately the development of a national PID strategy for Canada. Back in 2021, when we first started this work, we did not have budget or timeline to develop a full strategy. That is a multi-year, ongoing, iterative project. What we did have money for was what we were calling the roadmap to a roadmap. So it was the idea that we would identify the preconditions for success of the eventual development of a PID strategy, which is sort of a lot of ways of saying that they gave us some recommendations that pointed to things we needed to do now so that when we're developing the strategy, things will be easier to implement moving forward. And that's where we are now. Since the end of 2022, after the publication of the first phase report, we've been working on a number of different projects, including a list of challenges for research. So again, not thinking about PIDs as an end in and of themselves, thinking about PIDs as something that can solve potential problems. We know that this is the approach that other countries are taking, but it's possible that in Canada we have specific problems we want to address or specific priorities we want to address in specific ways. So we don't just want to say, let's do the same thing that Australia and the UK is doing. We want to sort of understand what our uniquely Canadian challenges are. We know that we're probably going to be working with ORCiD and a variety of DOIs and ROR, but we don't necessarily know how or in what order or where resourcing needs to go. So that's one of the first things we're really working on now, is thinking about those challenges and the problems that we need to identify and address, and which PIDs can address them and how. So assess which PIDs can resolve which challenges. This is the report that we published at the last year. Right now, in this second phase, we've done a few different things. We've developed with More Brains a theory of change, which is sort of acting as our North Star for the overarching vision of what this will look like over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. We're also working on audience-specific PID primers and briefings. So far, we've mostly focused on policymakers, government, and funders, because that's some of our sort of immediate priority, especially when it comes to questions of resourcing. But we are going to be working on primers and briefings for a variety of audiences, including librarians and researchers themselves, administrators, etc. We're looking at modeling out how PIDs can help optimize a variety of, not my favorite word, but workflows. And then ultimately that question of evidence of return on investment. The UK's done it, Australia's done it. We'd like to look at the Canadian context and identify what that might look like for us. And with the help of the CPDAC, CRKN, the Alliance, and More Brains have been developing 3 workshops. 2 of them are coming up in the next month or so, focused on, first of all, again, this funder question, infrastructure interoperability between funders and institutions. We want to identify those pain points, opportunities, and key actions that we can take right now or that we can work on developing in the future to better connect funder metadata and information to institutions. The second one is about integrations. So that's sort of the technical side. How are we getting ROR into our systems, ORCiD into our systems, etc. And then in the future, one that we have not developed yet, but one that we know is a really interesting and important question, is the question of equity and data sovereignty. We don't want to be reproducing sort of the challenge that already exists in the research ecosystem that maybe sort of prioritizes STEM-based metadata. In Canada, we need to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty. We certainly also need to talk about bilingualism. Silly example, the Research Organization Registry is dealing with some questions around how to manage multilingual or unilingual non-English names, because although it's an open piece of, although it's an open not-for-profit, it is built on some previous data that they're still working on addressing. So that's certainly a priority for us, of course, is to ensure that our francophone institutions aren't just being called University of Montreal, when technically that I don't think even exists as a legal entity. So with that, I know I've taken a little bit more time than was planned. Thank you so much, and happy to engage in discussion.
Thanks so much, John, for that very thorough and helpful overview. I think I'll be deferring to some of the steering committee members momentarily as we transition into breakout rooms, but we could probably spare a couple of minutes for questions. I see one in the chat already. Participants are welcome to raise their hand or to add questions to the chat. I'll go ahead and read out the one in the chat for you, John. So how would you feel about a government mandated requirement for ORCiDs? Would this be, sorry, part of my text is cut off. Would this be a win for ORCiD? How might this change the perception of ORCiD?
Thanks. Thanks so much, Julie. So that's a great question, and it's one that I think I've struggled with since I started in the role of ORCiD community manager. ORCiD's, I guess branding might be the right word, but sort of the way that it builds itself is as an organization that's researcher-centered, so that control is in researchers' hands. This is both one of the greatest strengths of ORCiD and institutionally one of the biggest headaches for ORCiD institutional members. Because of course, if things are research controlled, you can't just sort of batch create ORCiD IDs for your staff like you would an employee ID. So the question about mandating ORCiD at the governmental level, for example, in funder applications like the Tri-Agency, if we could get ORCiD into whatever is coming next after the CCV, that's been one of our priorities for a long time. But the question is mandated or optional? I think mandating it poses a problem to that vision of ORCiD as researcher controlled. And I don't think there's any way around it. I think that if there are institutions around the world that are mandating ORCiD, ORCiD, I wouldn't say is agnostic to that. ORCiD does sort of explicitly say that like this is a researcher controlled thing, but it's also not stopping institutions that are saying researchers should do this or must do this, I should say. Should is fine, must is strong. We're seeing different ways that this sort of question is being addressed. In the US, for example, when the NIH started, or maybe it was NSF started requiring ORCiD IDs, it was very explicitly for some, encouraged for all. I think that was the way that there was a blog post literally called ORCiD mandatory for some, encouraged for all. And it was like postdocs and graduate students who had to, but established scholars who didn't. So there's a sort of addressing the future where grad students are required to do it because you can sort of do that with grad students. They need that funding. They need that award in a way that maybe an established scholar is less susceptible to the same sorts of challenges. I mean, they are too, but even so. So it wasn't mandated for them. And I do have mixed feelings about that. I think this question about the perception is the right question because the answer is that, well, it's not researcher controlled if that's the case. There are still ways that researchers can manage their data. They can put a bunch of information in their ORCiD record to only me. So while they have to create one, maybe, if this were mandated, they don't have to fill it up. An ORCiD record only needs an email address that you can set to private and a first name. Those are the only things that need to be public. Everything else can be hidden, including from institutions where, because institutions can ask for permission to read hidden information. You can hide it a level beyond that so that even that permission doesn't give you access. So there are ways that scholars can get around that, and that could certainly be part of that discussion, because obviously mandating it would make my job a lot easier. So it's not that I hate the idea, but it is a real challenge to the messaging. So yeah, how would I feel about it? Mixed. Would it be a win? Probably in terms of adoption, and it would probably affect the perception as well.
Thanks. And I think since we have a lot of questions, we might just go ahead and let people ask questions. And if we don't have enough room or enough time for breakout rooms, then we'll just forego those. So I see Cassandra and then Christine next.
Hi, thanks, Julie. I'm Cassandra. I'm the ScholComm librarian at Royal Roads in Victoria. So I have a question about students and ORCiD IDs. I know, here we have a lot of students who are coming back kind of mid-career, and they may have publications that aren't research publications, or they're interested in doing publications during their degree, and they maybe will never do another research publication. When I meet with our doctoral students, I'm generally telling them about ORCiD. I'm telling them they should get an ORCiD. Some master's students will come to me asking about publishing. And I'm just curious, is there a best practice around kind of telling students to get an ORCiD if they may or may not actually publish? Like, is there a downside to that if it's kind of just a dead record with nothing in it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there are a few different facets to that. The first is that ORCiD IDs are required for a number of different things beyond just having a list of publications. For example, it can simply be a record of degree granting, and especially if an institution is the source of that information. If Royal Roads were to have an integration with ORCiD where it pushed that PhD or even just that undergrad degree and said, yes, here's your undergraduate degree granted by us, not just me claiming it. There's some sort of professionalism and credibility that is lent to that person in that specific way. So there's at least that benefit, even if there's no list of publications. You also need an ORCiD ID if you're going to be a research assistant managing someone else's ORCiD ID. And I could see that happening for a student who maybe isn't planning on publishing in the future, and it's just sort of a career tool that would be required of them just because their established scholar supervisor is not going to put their 400 publications into their own ORCiD record. So someone's got to do that for them, and they can be tasked with that. But in the long term, I also think it's helpful because if people are publishing with that same name or with a similar name, knowing that this is the John Aspler that has no publications but did get a degree in 1985, or knowing that this is one that's still publishing today, that is something helpful. So like our aspirational strategic goals for ORCiD Canada are everyone engaged in the research ecosystem in Canada has an ORCiD ID. That's obviously impossible, but I still think that it's useful even if people are ultimately never going back to it. Those won't be active ORCiD records. Those are not going to be included in like active ORCiD ID counts, but there's still use to it from a metadata perspective, knowing who's not publishing, and then also for that person to point back to as a potential credible source of their education, for example.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
So I have a question as well. What do you suggest for researchers or students or whoever got 2 or 3 or 4 ORCiD ID? Because I've seen it, like it's clearly from an institution. It's the same institution. It's a very specific name. It's not like, okay, there could be 2 John Smith at the same place, but sometimes it's like, no, it's clearly the same person. I know we only have one of that name here. How would you suggest dealing with that?
Yeah, great question. And I think this maybe ties into the comment you left there. I think there are some publishers that mandate ORCiD. That's sort of one of the big sources of multi-ORCiD record situations.
Yeah, because they kind of forget. And it's like, okay, I need it. I'll go create it. And as you said, it's like the name, email, let's go. And I'll just give a new one every time. It's less complicated than remembering.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a formal process that a scholar can, and I can find that link after this call, but a scholar can sort of say, hey, here are my 3 duplicate records. Can you please remove these 2 or combine certain elements of them? That's really the only approach here. I don't know that there's any way to do that for them. Again, the researcher-controlled nature of it, you can't just have someone say, hey, I'm pretty sure these 3 are the same. Can you please delete these 2? That wouldn't work. But having the person themselves say, like, here are 5 email addresses I've had over the years in association with a variety of institutions. These are all my accounts, and then ORCiD can deal with that for them. So from the perspective of folks on this call, it's always helpful to encourage scholars to do that if you've identified those problems, but it does have to come from the scholar side.
Thanks.
I see that we have one more question in the chat. As the tri-agencies revamp the common CV, has there been any more discussion about integrating PIDs into that workflow?
Yeah, that discussion has never stopped, has never not been going on. It's a real, I guess one of our highest strategic goals would be to get ORCiD integrated with, whether mandated or not, integrated into some sort of new or revamped CCV. As many of you have probably heard me say before, there is just going to be no update to the current edition of the CCV. Scholars have written open letters, you've probably seen those, and the government has basically said, wait till we have the next thing. So the conversations we've been having with the federal funders have been around getting ORCiD into, again, the revamp, the new, the updated, the replacement, whatever it's being framed as. That conversation is ongoing. And I should say that on the CPDAC, we have all 3 of the tri-agencies there, and we also have a representative from the team that's managing the update of the CCV. That's the Tri-Agency Grants Management Solutions Initiative, TGMS. And they're all there, so they're all very aware of these conversations. The workshop that we're aiming to do at the end of April about funder institutional connectivity, we're really aiming to invite, and we have a good number of folks from across the tri-agency there to have those conversations. And it's one of those things where, the long answer is, yeah, we're talking about it and we're very excited for something to happen. And the sort of even longer answer is that nothing can be guaranteed until the government decides to take the step to do this. And one of the reasons why we're still sort of waiting is that the revamp of the CCV has been in procurement for a very long time. And until it's procured, they're not going to say, we're integrating ORCiD in this way or in this timeline. Once it's procured, once it's implemented, we'll continue having those conversations, but I think we'll have a better sense of what can actually be done. So I wish I could say, yes, we're doing it, it's happening. That's always been the goal. And a lot of the people who can make those decisions are involved in these discussions. but it's just got to follow the government process, which is going to continue to take a while.
I see comment here. Super helpful answer. Thank you. Keep fighting the good fight. We have another question. So the main goal of all PIDs should be to make it easy for the scientists. So how can we put up with the proprietary ID systems for authors of some data providers and the mess they created? There should be one system. Are there any initiatives to force them into ORCiD and give up their systems?
Yeah, that's such an interesting, and I'd say probably deeply political question. ORCiD is an organization, and I should say I don't work for ORCiD, which is why I'm fairly comfortable saying what I'm about to say, which is that ORCiD has to play nice with the folks within the ecosystem. You know, if Elsevier and Scopus and PubMed, or I should say Publons from Web of Science, and like if these organizations are not engaging with ORCiD, if their journals do not connect to ORCiD, there's basically the carrot version of using ORCiD sort of gets a significantly weaker. Obviously, this is where our institutions and governments come in and our funders, but right now it really is the publishers that are sort of leading this please create an ORCiD ID process. So when we talk about proprietary ID systems, I completely agree that ideally we would just be using ORCiD. But the way that ORCiD works, especially within the ecosystem, is that it has to connect to, or at least enable folks to connect to ORCiD from all of these spaces. So there is a Scopus and ORCiD integration, and the metadata that comes to ORCiD from Scopus is framed in the way that metadata from Scopus is framed. And the metadata from PubMed and the metadata from Publons, it's all built around the BibTeX or whatever version of that metadata, whatever it looks like for each specific database. ORCiD does not act as a quality control space. It's not smoothing data or managing data to make it, you know, a very particular format. There is a field in ORCiD in the publication or the work section called citation, and pretty much every piece of metadata that isn't sort of like the title of the article and the authors and a few like the journal title can be shoved into there, whether that's page numbers or issue number or whatever. And the format of that looks very different every time. So yeah, garbage in, garbage out. I don't know that ORCiD has a vision to suggest that it becomes sort of like the quality control, here is what metadata needs to look like. I think that would probably, especially with ORCiD being a fairly lean, not-for-profit team of 35 to 40 staff members, I think that would probably be an impossibility. I don't know that that would work. But certainly as we think about a Canadian national strategy and as we look towards, you know, what it means to work with PIDs, we're certainly prioritizing, especially in the Canadian context, you know, PIDs in DSpace and PIDs in Dataverse and PIDs in OJS, so your open infrastructure pieces. We still need to connect to other things, and other things need to connect to ORCiD, and I don't think that we're ever going to not have those other proprietary systems. But at the very least, ORCiD can pull stuff from Scopus and Web of Science and other proprietary systems, and even connect the different researcher IDs that are out there. Scopus ID is a PID. It's just a proprietary PID. And Web of Science ID or researcher ID, that's a PID. It's just a proprietary PID. So those things can also be stored in an ORCiD record, and hopefully that just helps with that flow of metadata.
Thank you. So it looks like we have a couple of minutes left. If there are any remaining burning questions, comments that anyone wants to add, either in chat or by raising their hand. I see Thane has her hand up.
Yeah, thanks, John, for the excellent presentation and everyone for your great questions. I really like your comment about how PIDs can save us time and money if there's enough uptake. Do you have how much uptake does there need to be before time and money is saved? Do you have a sense of that? And it may not be an exact number.
Yeah, it's the reason it's incredibly hard to say is because this thing is everything from at the institutional level to the federal level. If you're a university, if a university were to create a series of connections in all of its systems, so its publishing platform, its repositories, its grant management system, whatever systems that institution has, if that one institution makes all of that happen, then every scholar at that institution will see significant benefits. when it comes to their institutional engagement. They still have to apply for federal and provincial funding, and if those systems are not integrated, then they're not going to see that benefit. And when the institutions are asked to make those integrations happen, well, they want to see a certain amount of scholars already using it to see the impact. So it becomes difficult to, there really is a chicken and egg problem. And so I know that, for example, the UK report talks about like 85% adoption of ORCiD as saving tens of millions of dollars. And I can point you to those two reports in Australia and the UK that do talk about percentage uptake. But some scholars can see significant benefit even locally if that institution does a lot, or all scholars will see some benefit if major publishers or the funders connect it. So it's really hard to say what that time looks like and what percentage of uptake is needed, given that you can have one institution doing a lot for everyone there.
Thanks. That's a great answer. Unknown at this point, I guess, but the more use, the better, right? And the more we can get there and to see those time and savings. We still have a few minutes. Wondering if I can throw out a question to attendees, if you're comfortable talking about the barriers that you've faced at your institution or as an individual around PID adoption or ORCiD adoption, to be more specifically. And I think that would be curious to explore that a little bit before we go. So if anybody has any thoughts about barriers that you've faced or seen around ORCiD adoption at your institution, feel free to share. And if not, I will just jump in here and say what I often see with ORCiD adoption of Alberta is people have an ORCiD, but it's not populated, or there's like 2 journal articles there and nothing else, and they have like 200 publications. And I just I'm curious to know more about why that is and why that's happening. And Laura's in the chat, kind of the same thing, no system to integrate, the same for us. And lack of ownership within a single unit. I don't know, does that sound familiar to you, John, what you've heard?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Systems, of course, are like, you get the benefit of disambiguation regardless. When we're talking about ORCiD, when we're talking about DOIs, I mean, you can manually register DOIs for reports and things like that. But of course, you start to see time saving more and more with those systems. So without a system, this is very common. And it's often not just systems, but a lack of capacity to develop for existing systems. So both of those problems, you don't have the tools or you don't have the tools to build the tools. And then lack of ownership within a single unit. Yeah, that's sort of where that within an institution connection has to happen. It has to be, your library collaborating with your research office, collaborating with IT at the very least. You can get a little bit done from each place, but all together is where you can get more done.
Yeah, thanks. There's another question in the chat about is CRKN thinking that they might invest in consortial access to other PIDs beyond DataCite and ORCiD?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know that we can say that CRKN itself can invest or would invest directly in that. I mean, we already are obviously in the PIDs that we support and the work we do towards the development of a broader strategy. But I think part of what makes a community-based approach, a consortial approach, sustainable and manageable is that membership in them drives the sustainability. People can pay fees, and then we can do the thing that they need to do and provide that service. ROAR does not really have, it's new, right? They don't have a consortia-driven model. So we need to think more about top-down approaches, like how do we integrate ROAR into existing systems that our institutions use? And that's where sort of that partnership with the Alliance really comes in. That is really where we're hoping that we can do more in the future with more funding. For now, we do have funds to offset membership in the existing consortia and toward the development of a national strategy. And so that is all where we're looking. But yeah, it's hard to say what that will look like, other than the development of the strategy is specifically to see how we can move beyond just ORCiD Canada and DataCite Canada. How do we create communities around ROAR and RAID and cross-ref DOIs? There is a way to do that, but it's not the same kind of consortial model. So we need to think a little bit more about how that can work.
Great, thanks for coming to the end of our time. So I just want to thank Julie for doing such a great job being the facilitator today, and to John, of course, for an excellent presentation. And I feel we had a bunch of questions for breakout rooms. We didn't get to them. I'm feeling maybe I'll be brave and post them on our Google group, and maybe we can explore those over email. If people want to, or you can just ignore it. That's fine. I know everybody has a lot of stuff going on right now. And I also wanted to remind everyone that the first book club meeting, hopefully I've got this right, is on the 11th of April. No, that's today. It's not today. Is it today? The first book club, Philippe? No, I don't know what the date is. Philippe, maybe you need to jump in here. I have the wrong information. But yeah, so let Philippe take over to tell you about the book club, because obviously I have the wrong information. But thanks again to everyone for showing up today, and I'll see you at the next one. Thanks, Philippe.
Yes, hello everyone. It's on April 25, not today. It's at 1 p.m. and you can just contact me if you want to be added. So far, we are almost 35 people, I think. So I think we will be able to have good discussions already. But the more we are, the best it will be. So you're welcome. So thank you. Is it all? Thank you, everyone. I will let Julie finish the meeting.
Sure, I'll just be super quick to say again on behalf of Carl, to thank John for his presentation, attendees for their participation, and members of the Carl Canadian BRI Community of Practice Steering Committee for organizing this call. So have a great week, all.